Hello everyone. Please excuse the lack of a reading in today's podcast episode. We had that wonderful internet problem. Lag. Hello and welcome to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 38. I'm Charlie Place and, well, she's back. The writer who brought us House of Shadows, The Phantom Tree, The Woman in the Lake and the Wormhole Podcast episode 1. Talking today about last year's The Forgotten Sister and the forthcoming The Last Daughter. Hello, Nicola Cornick.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me back. It's such a pleasure to be talking to you again.
Pleasure's all mine. I'm so happy that you've come back. How are you?
Yes, I'm not too bad. Thank you very much. I'm simultaneously trying to build up to the publication of The Last Daughter in July and trying to finish a book I'm writing at the moment as well. So very poor time management on my part there with a deadline and a book launch at the same time.
Well, how was writing and reading different for you during the lockdown and now, I suppose, as well?
Oh, well, yes. I mean, I've talked to lots of other people about this and readers, authors, both, a lot of us. And I certainly found that my concentration was dreadfully impaired by all the huge things that were happening in the world. And I'm not making any secret of the fact that The Last Daughter actually had to be rewritten completely. I'd actually finished the first draft of it when all of this started to happen. When it went into my editor, she was great. She was absolutely brilliant. It became apparent when my revisions on the first time it went in, when they came back, there was going to be a lot of work on this book. Eventually, I managed to come up with the second version of it, which is a very different book from the first one. It was the most difficult book that I've ever tried to write. Now I've had to actually retrain to concentrate. So I physically take myself to an office because that was the only way that I found that I could sit down and write without being distracted. And the same applied to reading. I couldn't even read for some of the time during lockdown. And I know I'm not alone in that. And I think we've all just found that the effects of lockdown and the pandemic have just been enormous in so many different ways. We've all had to find our own way through that, haven't we?
Well, it sounds like a tremendous amount of work because, of course, The Forgotten Daughter was out last year. And to have effectively written, I suppose you could say, almost 2 books in that last time span, in the same amount of time span.
Well, I think that one benefit out of that, and I'm being really positive about this, is the first version of it is actually a story I will reuse in the future. It's an idea that I absolutely love. It just needs the right book. And this wasn't it. The Last Daughter that emerged was quite different, but I have got a lot of material I can use in future. So that's great.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And yeah, I'll definitely be interested in reading the first version as well and seeing what you do with that in future. I know you had, or you have, a role at Lydiard House.
Yeah, that's actually really exciting at the moment because Lydiard House is an 18th century mansion house in Swindon, near where I live. And I was invited to join the trustees a couple of years ago. We've been working on a project where we're digitising all of our Lydiard Park archive so that it's going to be available to anybody who wants to look at it online. And we're actually launching that project in September as part of the Heritage Open Days project. One of the things we have is a recipe book that was written in the 17th century. It's called Recipes. A lot of it is herbal sort of medicines and that kind of thing, but there are also recipes and other things like that in there. So as part of the Heritage Open Days, we're going to be recreating some of these 17th century recipes outdoors. Probably a good job in case we set fire to anything. But in September, when the Heritage Open Day weekend is happening, and we're going to be launching our archive at the same time, hopefully with something that actually is edible, even if it was originally made in the 17th century. So I'm quite excited about that. It's a really great project that we're all involved with there.
Yeah, that sounds brilliant, and I will look up some information and add it into the episode description. So if we get to The Forgotten Sister first, listeners, The Forgotten Sister looks at the mystery surrounding the death of Amy Robsart, who was married to Elizabeth I's favourite, Robert Dudley, and it does this via a historical narrative and modern day narrative with some time slipping involved. Hopefully that's not too much information for everybody. Tudor history is pretty popular. Most people will know a fair amount of Elizabeth I, Many will know about Robert Dudley and the scandals, but we barely hear of Amy Robsart. Who was she?
Amy was Robert's first wife, and they married when they were both very young. In fact, they were very close in age, both of them 18. It's interesting how Amy's story has really got swept away by what happened subsequently to Robert and by his relationship with Queen Elizabeth I. They think it was a love match between the two of them. She was the daughter of a Norfolk gentleman. So in terms of status, she was quite a long way socially below Robert, who obviously was already the son of a very powerful man and was kind of ambitious for his own future. But Amy was an heiress in her own right. Her father made her his heir. It was kind of a good strategic marriage, really, for the two of them. Obviously, she got to go up the social scale, and then he was rich and arguably good looking. So it's an interesting kind of dynastic match there. Amy, we do know, was described as being very beautiful. Like I mentioned in the story, she was also an educated woman, and I think this is really important. We know she could read or write. She'd been trained to run a household. So later on, when she becomes this very shadowy figure, and really all we ever hear about is how she died in suspicious circumstances, that masks, all the other aspects of her life. And yeah, I mean, I wanted to learn more about Amy, really. So when I researched the book, it was all about finding out what the woman behind this. Everybody knew she fell down the stairs and died or whatever, but nobody knew who she was.
Well, I did notice that you brought to the fore her learning, and also in the way that you do the fiction, there's a bit more personality in the intellect of her. Would you say that the present day narrative that you've got helped look at the historical story in a more objective manner?
That's really interesting. I think it does, actually. Generally, if you're examining, as I do in a dual time story, a historical mystery through that sort of prism of a modern day story, it gives you that objectivity to just take a step back and look at it. And I think, you've got the two different stories running parallel. You've got the hopefully very sort of personal story in the historical strand, and then you've got a more analytical approach in the modern day strand. And I think maybe particularly with The Forgotten Sister, I felt that certainly that happened, that it really helped to throw some light on Amy's story and on the historical aspects of it, yeah.
Well, I loved how you had the modern day aspect effectively told by Elizabeth I and the historical told by Amy, and then, in the opposite narrative for each character, they don't have so much of a voice. I thought that was a really interesting way of doing it. So, I mean, we've got this mystery that we may not work out what happened, how she came to die. She was found at the bottom of a staircase. Among the press of the time and then the historians, the idea persisted that Robert Dudley was responsible.
Yeah, because Robert by that stage had very definitely fallen out of love with Amy. He had known Elizabeth, Princess Elizabeth, as she was when he first knew her, since they were both children. I think a very close relationship had developed between the two of them. And Robert, I think it's fair to say, Robert did have an eye to marrying Elizabeth were he to be free. So you can see why, as soon as Amy dies and the circumstances are not clear, finger of blame is going to point very, very firmly in Robert's direction, because, of course, it did mean that he was free to marry Elizabeth. Of course, the irony there, I suppose, and the way that the circle sort of closed was that the very scandal of Amy's death and the way that he was tarred with that forever afterwards meant that's a very strong reason why he could never marry Elizabeth. And so, yes, I mean, I think that adds the extra layer really to the mystery, that he got what he wanted, but not in the way he wanted it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was very interesting to read about, particularly in your fiction. I did some research to find out the factual stuff and how it all came together. It's really fascinating. Do you think that Elizabeth I and Robert Dudley were literal lovers?
I don't. Yes, it's one of those questions, isn't it? The sort of where you end up speculating because you really don't have the facts one way or the other to base it on. I think, having studied Elizabeth's character, I think it's possible, yes. I think Elizabeth's character is so fascinating in terms of her relationship with other people, not just with men, but particularly with power, that she was never, ever going to risk sharing power with anyone, not even somebody that she loved as much as she really did love Robert, I think. And of course, through the decades, their relationship did change inevitably, as relationships do, so that towards the end they were very loving friends, I suppose you could say. But yes, I suspect when both of them were young and very passionate, that could quite easily have happened.
It makes me think also, of course, of the scandal that was with, I'm forgetting his name now.
Thomas Seymour,
That's
yeah.
it, Thomas Seymour. And
Yeah.
everything that's to do with that, and it's kind of obsession, I suppose, that history has of the Virgin Queen, and was she and wasn't she?
Yes, well, I think that was very unfortunate. I mean, I'm one of the people who actually don't think that Elizabeth and Thomas had that kind of a relationship. I mean, I'm not giving Thomas any credit for that again, but I think he was a very interesting character. He's another absolutely fascinating character, and I do talk about the Seymours more as the background for the Phantom Tree than any of the other books. But I have studied Thomas quite a lot as a result of that. But I think there was definitely some, again, sort of power imbalance in that relationship and dodgy things going on. I don't think Elizabeth was physically involved with him. So I imagine that did have, again, a very powerful influence on her. When you think about all of the psychological influences on poor old Elizabeth right from the start, with a father like hers and losing her mother and all the rest of it, well, it's a bit of a nightmare, really. The remarkable thing about her is I think that she came through all of that and was such a extraordinary woman and leader. There are times when I don't like Elizabeth very much, but I always admire her.
Yeah, my feelings are pretty much similar. It makes me think of the painting of when she's 15 or 16, and it's just so compelling, I think.
Yeah.
How she is, and you can see there's a leader there. I mean, okay,
Yeah.
benefit of hindsight and all that.
Well, I think she did prove herself. Again, yeah, I mean, the environment of the time for a woman to be able to rule. And of course, we're looking at, again, quite a lot of very biased narratives, mostly written by men. So it becomes all the more extraordinary, I think, the more you look at it, really.
Well, we obviously had to talk about Elizabeth, but we're going to have to go back to Amy. She hasn't had much time at all in history. If I may ask the kind of ultimate question, I suppose, what do you think happened?
In regard to her death?
Yes.
I think it was an accident. I've read about it a lot, I've thought about it a lot, and I genuinely think it was. And I think that, again, as with history so often happens, it wasn't that long ago that they actually discovered the original coroner's report that had been lost. And the more you find out about what actually happened, I think it was a tragic accident. I don't think Robert killed her, because I think again, I don't like Robert Dudley very much for lots of reasons, but I don't think he was a stupid man. And I think he would have realised it wouldn't have benefited him, if you like. And I don't think Amy would have taken her own life because of the religious connotations around that, how strong the church view was about the sin of suicide. She was a very devout person. And even though she had been reported as being kind of despairing about Robert's attitude towards her and about his relationship with the Queen, her servants at the time were very quick to say that wasn't strong enough to have made her take her own life. So I don't think that she did that. I think it was just terribly sad, a terrible thing that happened.
They sound very loyal, those servants, definitely. Can you tell us about the sightings of Amy's ghost?
The supernatural elements, I think stories like this inevitably lend themselves to supernatural elements. And actually, Amy's ghost has been seen all over the place. It's been seen in Norfolk, a bit like Anne Boleyn, really. It's been seen in Stansfield in Norfolk, where she lived, and a couple of other places. And there are these sort of strong stories of hauntings at Cumnor, even though the house isn't standing any longer. And these sort of originate from the time in the 18th century when it was still standing. A lot of the stories about Amy's ghost actually originate from Sir Walter Scott, who wrote about the story of Amy and Robert in his book Kenilworth, although he changed details. And they were picked up by late 18th and early 19th century antiquarians who picked up on this idea of Amy being the poor victim of this dastardly man. And so it's hard to disentangle where the original stories came from, whether in fact, there were stories of hauntings at Cumnor House, or whether they cropped up later after people had read Sir Walter Scott. So, I mean, I always find it really interesting trying to work out how stories like that began. And I haven't been able to pin that one down at all. All I know is that there are a number of stories about Amy and hauntings that abound both in Oxfordshire and in Norfolk, where she was born. But yes, it's a perfect story, really, to the thought of her being done to death or dying in these terrible circumstances and then haunting the ruins of the house forever after, really.
It's interesting, if I say the word interesting, it's interesting that in death she's been more known of than in life.
That was one of the reasons, actually, that I wanted to write about her, that very reason, because it was all about, if you've heard of her at all, you know how she died and the fact that her legend has lived on for hundreds of years. And yet, actually, the real Amy is completely lost. You know, who was she and what she was like? And also, I thought that was significant that they lost her tomb as well. You know, she was buried in the University Church in Oxford. But at some point, when they rearranged the interior, they lost the place where they buried her, and nobody's sure where it is now. And that kind of felt so representative of Amy's story altogether, really. So one of the reasons I wanted to write the book was to find out more about her and bring her story out more in the narrative, so that there was more about Amy and we actually got a feel for what she might have been like.
Well, I'm going to pass on talking too much about the modern day story because I just think the way you've done it is just so good, and leave readers to find it out.
Thank you.
So the title is absolutely genius. I'm deliberately not saying it again. Absolutely genius one. And I know the last time I read the book the first time last year, I just laughed my head off when I finished the book and I'd forgotten everything. Who thought of this?
I have to be honest here and say I suspect that the title was probably relatively generic when it was first invented. There's fashions, isn't there, in choosing titles for different genres of books. Hence, Forgotten Sisters and Lost Daughters and Last Daughters and so on. And I can't honestly remember whether, thinking back to that time, I suspect that those words got put together, and I don't think I wrote the book to fit the words. I think I just suddenly thought, oh, okay, that actually could work quite well. So it was great. And sort of fitted the story in a relatively subtle way. And but I think that was probably a bonus, to be honest.
I found you've kind of increasingly you started from something that's kind of time slip, time travel, and then you've gone more time slip each time, which has been interesting. And then in The Forgotten Sister, you've gone back a bit to time travel.
Mm-hmm.
If you say these are two different things, do you have a preference for time slip or time travel?
I find time travel fascinating to write, but really difficult to make convincing. So I have to be absolutely convinced in my own mind. You know, I don't want to be distracted by the technicalities of time travel. So I found that a lot more difficult to write. And in fact, again, it's not much of a spoiler really, but The Last Daughter has an element of time travel in it. And I swore after I'd finished that I wasn't going to do it again. So the book I'm writing at the moment is a time slip again. I think it can be done really well. I mean, I was reading The Rose Garden by Susanna Kersley, rereading it yesterday, and that obviously is a time travel book, and that's just superbly written. But it's really hard, and so my preference is for time slip.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would deliberately leave it there. I won't make any further mention of what I would like to say because I don't want to spoil it too much. If we move on to The Last Daughter, it's out in July in the UK and November in the US, where it's called The Last Daughter of York. Tell us about it.
Well, The Last Daughter of York, I suppose the US title is a little bit of a spoiler there. But again, another dual time novel. This time I've gone back a little bit earlier than I normally do to the Wars of the Roses in the 1400s. And at the heart of the book, again, things that you find in all of my books, I think, there's a historical mystery waiting to be solved, and there's also the story of a woman from the footnotes of history. In this particular instance, it's Anne Lovell, the wife of Richard III's closest friend and ally, Francis Lovell, who is the protagonist of the historical story. I'm trying to sort of describe it and make it sound enticing without giving too much away. But the big mystery at the heart of the historical story of The Last Daughter is the disappearance of the princes in the Tower and the involvement of Anne and Francis Lovell in that story. But again, alongside that, I have a contemporary thread. And I think really the theme of The Last Daughter is all about disappearances in one shape or form or another. So yes, the whole thing is built around the mystery of the princes in the Tower, which is something that has fascinated me for so many years. I always swore I would write a book about it, and finally I have done.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's one thing that I thought about when we were recording last time. I thought, I'm going to have her on to talk about the princes in the Tower. I know, and if I say this to everybody, that your views on the mysteries don't necessarily reflect what you write in the fiction, so I think we're safe enough to do this. Who do you think killed the princess in the tower?
Oh, do you know, I find that such a difficult question. And I mean, I studied the mystery of the Princess in the Tower when I did my first degree in history, longer ago than I can bear to think now. But before that, I had an emotional attachment to the story because I read The Daughter of Time when I was about 11. And so I became a hugely strong Ricardian. So I was absolutely convinced that there was no way he could possibly have killed them. And I held to that opinion even after I'd studied them, really. And I think this is where, unusually, there's a contrast between how I feel emotionally and how I feel as a historian. So objectively, I would say that he probably did kill them. So I am saying here, objectively speaking, I believe Richard III probably did have the princes in the tower murdered. But I think there is room for doubt on that one. And, well, the biggest mystery to me is that we don't know. I suppose it's very similar to Amy's story in a way. You know, a crime has been committed, we assume, which might not even be a crime. We don't even know that. We don't know, and that's extraordinary. And what's even more extraordinary, I think, is that probably maybe we don't even want to know. I have a theory that if we did know the answer to that, that would take away part of the pleasure of speculating over this particular historical mystery. So on the one hand, I have a very nebulous but incredibly powerful emotional attachment to the idea that it definitely was not Richard who murdered his nephews, and that something else happened to them or somebody else was responsible. And on the other hand, the part of me that does try to be objective but cannot be over Richard III is always nudging me to say, oh, come on, medieval kings behave like that. In fact, it was almost de rigueur that you should behave like that if you were a medieval king, if you wanted to survive. So, yeah, big conflict going on in my head there, but that's what I think.
Yeah, interesting. You've raised a good point as well that, I mean, if we learned what happened, which would be, I mean, probably even bigger potentially than finding Richard III's skeleton a few years back, we would have to change everything in that history that we teach and that we learn and everything.
Yes, I mean, it would be an enormous. It would be enormous. You're right. I mean, the excitement that was generated around the discovery of the body of Richard III was fascinating because, of course, it was fascinating finding that, but it didn't actually change very much. It kind of reinforced some of the views about what we actually knew about Richard or thought from archaeological and other evidence, but it didn't change the narrative of, we still don't know what happened. Yeah, and I mean, it's hard to see how we could find that out anyway, to be absolutely certain. Part of me quite likes to think that, what if we did discover that evidence? What would happen? Because I think it's an absolutely fascinating idea. But also, I think it would be psychologically damaging. And I'm not saying this in a frivolous way. I think it would be psychologically damaging for an awful lot of people who feel so strongly about this. One of the things that interests me about Richard, and again, not only did I study that period of history when I was at university, but I actually studied Richard III specifically as part of my dissertation on heroes for my master's degree, because he is a hero to so many people. And so psychologically to discover that he wasn't a hero, I think would have a really, really bad effect, it would on me, to have that confirmed. So, I mean, it's such an interesting and intricate topic there. A part of me just would never want to know.
Well, you've given me something to think about. Definitely, because I'd learned first about it as a child, and I somehow managed to not find it scary at all or whatever, even though I was very young, and instead just found it really mysterious and interesting to know. But it's been something that pretty much my entire life, I've been wanting it to be found out. So to think of everything that could happen and would happen and would have to, it would, it's something definitely to think about. I hadn't actually thought about before, so I thank you for that.
You're very welcome. It's a disturbing topic in lots of different ways.
Very, very, very. Links to purchase The Forgotten Sister and The Last Daughter are in the episode description, along with my email address. Nicola, I have had so much fun having you back. This has been wonderful. I just really enjoyed hearing your answers, and as I said, The Princess of the Tower, and also hearing about Amy Robsart, and your opinions there have been fantastic. And it's been lovely to have you back. Thank you so much for coming back today.
Thanks very much.
The next interview will be on Monday the 14th of June. The Wormhole Podcast, episode 38, was recorded on the 14th of May and published on the 24th of May 2021. Music and production by Charlie Place.